Windows Overview and Compatibility. In this nugget, we take a look at Windows Overview and compatibility issues. We start off by taking a look at 32-bit versions of Windows versus 64-bit versions of Windows. Now, this is a key thing to keep in mind because you can use the maximum power in your processor depending upon which version you go with. And you might also want to maximize the amount of memory you have installed. I mean, you can actually buy extra memory and install it properly, and yet Windows won't recognize it. Well, what's causing that? Well, we'll take a look at some memory limits. Also, we'll take a look at a Windows overview, what you'll see in the interface differences between the various versions of Windows, and also user account control, which started with Windows Vista and is probably going to be in every version of Windows from this point forward. We'll also take a look here at compatibility mode, which is a great way to make sure that your older applications can continue to run in current versions of Windows. I remember that when my wife and I were young and first getting started in life, that we lived in Houston, Texas. My wife probably wouldn't like the way I put that just now, would she? When we were young in the past tense. Okay, when we were younger, we used to live in Houston, Texas, and I used to have to commute clear from one end of Texas to the other. Not Texas, I'm Houston. Wow, can you imagine commuting from one end of Texas to the other on a daily basis? It seemed like that, though, when I lived in Houston anyway, because it seemed like it took forever to get to the other side of town, even though we had an 8-lane highway. It was some kind of an interstate. I don't remember the number of it right now, but it was a big, gigantic highway. And then sometimes I thought to myself, how much worse would this be if it was just kind of your standard 4-lane highway? Well, it's kind of like that with processing and operating systems here in Windows as well, because you can have 32-bit processors and operating systems, or 64-bit processors and operating systems, and it's really kind of like 32 lanes of traffic versus 64 lanes of traffic, and we've discussed this a little bit in the past. Now, this is not actually going to equivocate to exactly twice the performance in all instances, because it just depends upon what kind of resources are needed. For example, if I have a 32-bit processor in a computer and lots of extra memory, but I have a 64-bit processor in another computer with barely enough memory, well, the paging alone is going to substantially slow that computer down dramatically more than this 32-bit processor and computer. So there are certainly other factors that play into that. Plus, some applications don't really need that much processing power. Right now, I'm running Photoshop. I got Outlook over to the side. I've got Lightroom open, and I'm using my recording software. And you can see that doing all those things, I still have barely any CPU utilization here. It's only 16%. This is a gadget, by the way, you can download for Windows 7 or Windows Vista. I kind of like it. It shows the amount of memory and how much of the processing power on each one of the quad 4 core processors I'm using. Anyway, so you can see in this case, it probably wouldn't really matter if I was using 32-bit or 64-bit processing. Let's find another example. How about, let me crack open calculator here. Where is that? Oh, there it is. Okay, so if I'm doing some calculations, and by the way, I always use this scientific calculator because it makes me look really just scary smart. Anyway, I'm just going to mash some numbers together here, and I'll do that, and then I'll do that, and then I'll do this, and wow, you see? Only a super smart person could possibly come up with a number that big, so that must be me. Anyway, I'll do all of these numbers, and I mash them all together, and I don't know what that is, invalid input. I was always afraid that would happen when I got into my 40s. It's a little awkward, and I apologize. This has really never happened to me before. But anyway, you can see that as I start to mash these numbers together and everything, it's not going to really matter if it was a 32-bit processor or what in the world it is that I'm using, because the perceived performance is going to really be the same. And in order to detect any difference between 32 and 64-bit processing, you probably need some kind of scientific instrumentation. But other things really do need and depend upon high processor utilization. Scientific applications. I'm using Photoshop here. That's what I do my whiteboards with, even though it's really pretty much overkill. I don't really need it just for these little whiteboards. But when I use large panoramas and large graphics and large photographs, this really chews up a lot of CPU utilization. So certainly sometimes there's a big advantage in using the 64-bit operating systems. Now, if you want to use a 64-bit processor and a 64-bit operating system, then you can use XP or Vista or 2003 or 2008. These are all available in a 64 or 32-bit edition with some limitations. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, James, I'm not sure that's right. I thought I heard there was a 64-bit edition of Windows 2000 as well. Well, not for professional, which is what the A+ would focus on. There is an Itanium 64 edition of Windows 2000 Server that was available, but not professional. Also, this is processor dependent. Okay, so if you have an X86 x86 processor, that's the Intel architecture that is a 32-bit architecture, then you can only use a 32-bit processor. Or if you have the AMD equivalent of that as well. If you have an x64, however, and that's just the generic designation for a 64-bit processor, then you can use 64-bit operating systems, or you could still install 32-bit. Okay, it's not as much fun to have a 64-bit processor and use only half of its potential, but certainly that does happen. And in fact, that's one of my first 64-bit processors was a Sony Vaio laptop, and I was all excited because I said, "Hey, 64-bit processing power! I can have a 64-bit edition of Windows, right?" Wrong. Sony installed a 32-bit version of Windows on it, and they never made available any 64-bit drivers. Therefore, it made it impossible to ever use a 64-bit edition of Windows on that 64-bit processor. So basically, I bought the marketing hype of the 64-bit processor and got none of the advantage from Sony. All right, I admit I'm still a little bit bitter about that. Anyway, so since that system did not perform as well as I liked, I gave that laptop to my daughter. That's right. I give my kids all the stuff that doesn't work very well. However, the future of processing is going to be only 64. In fact, I doubt that you can even buy a 32-bit processor, off the shelf anymore, unless it's just a replacement part. You got a bad processor and you want to replace one. But if you're buying new systems that are already put together, I don't think anyone's even selling 32 bits anymore. Windows Server 2008 R2 is only 64-bit. That's all you can get with Server 2008 R2, for example. Also bear in mind that even though you're using 64-bit operating system, any operating system function will be able to take advantage of that. However, some things are only going to be 32-bit availability, such as your applications. 64-bit apps are pretty scarce. I only know of a few, and most of them have to do with graphics and photography and stuff like that. I use Lightroom. That's a 64-bit edition. This is a 32-bit edition of Photoshop that I'm using right now. I think I mentioned that earlier, but if I drag this down, you can see I'm using Photoshop right here. It's actually just a 32-bit edition. Why am I doing that, even though I have a 64-bit edition available? Well, number one, 64 bits is overkill just for drawing on the screen, unless I'm using heavy graphics or complex calculations or something like that. And a lot of the plugins, such as these that I use, which are great plugins, but they're only available right now in 32-bit edition, although they will be available as 64 bits later on. So I say all of that to tell you this. Most of your users are still only going to have 32-bit apps, and so they may still have performance limitations because of that. Some of the server products, however, are going to predominantly 64-bit editions, such as Microsoft Exchange Server, 64-bit, certain versions of SQL as well. And many other products on the high end are probably going to be 64-bit or maybe even exclusively for the future. Also, 64-bit drivers are now mostly available. It seemed like it took at least 2 years between the time that 64-bit processors and operating systems were released and between the time that happened and the vendors made available 64-bit drivers. I mean, you really cannot use 64-bit Windows if you don't have drivers for all the stuff you use. So it kind of put us in a catch-22 for a while there. Also be aware of the fact that a lot of your applications, actually all of your applications that are 32-bit, will be installed in a different directory than they've been in the past. And for that, let me just crack open Windows Explorer here. This is actually in Windows 7, but it's the same in Vista, so I'll just do it this way. If I go into, where am I at here? The C drive. Then we go down to these directories. Notice we have program files. That's what you might be accustomed to seeing. But now you also have program files x86. Program files here is for 64-bit applications. And there are some applications that it doesn't really matter if they get installed in program files or the x86 one. Okay, like certain shared components and stuff. That's why even though I'm running a 32-bit edition of Microsoft Office, we still see some components that appear right here. However, the 32-bit components or 32-bit applications will now go into the program files x86. And again, the x86 is the designation for the Intel architecture that's a 32-bit architecture. And again, there you can see there's parts of Office over here as well for that. Okay, so just be aware of the fact that you'll have a different directory for that. You'll need to know that. And we will also take a look at some other directories that that you'll need to know about at a future point in time here. Now, before we move on, I want to also talk to you about some memory limits. This is important to know for the A+ exam objectives. For XP and Vista in particular, because they're the ones that apply 32-bit or 64-bit processing. Okay. Now, if you're running a 32-bit edition of XP or Vista, You're limited to 4 gigabytes. So if the option comes up where you'll have a customer that says, hey, I just installed 8 gigs of RAM, and I know I installed it right, it's in the right place in the motherboard and so forth, but when I go to the system properties for Windows, it says I only have 4 gigabytes. What's with that? Well, that's because Windows Vista and XP and 32-bit editions only address 4 gigabytes. So any additional memory really is wasted. Now, if you're running a 64-bit edition of either of these operating systems, you can go up to 128 gigabytes. And then if you're running Windows 7 operating systems in 64-bit editions, you can go up to 192 gigabytes for Ultimate and Enterprise and Professional editions, by the way. It's not an exam item, just an FYI. Now, if you're running one of the starter editions, we haven't really talked about that much because it's not particularly an A+ item, but XP and Vista are available, as well as Windows 7, are available in what we call starter editions. And for XP and Vista, these are 32-bit versions of the operating system. These were designed to be very stripped down versions of Windows that have very few features installed on them that you would normally get in a default installation of Windows. And it was partially devised, to my understanding, as a way of helping to get around some of the European Union restrictions on Microsoft's monopoly of things like Internet Explorer and so forth. But anyway, for XP Starter, you can go a maximum of 512 megabytes. Vista Starter, 1 gigabyte. And again, those are 32-bit only. Other things you'll need to know about for A+ exam objective purposes is kind of a Windows overview. You should be able to quickly and easily identify each edition of Windows, each version of Windows that we go through here, and visually identify it. And if you can't visually identify it, you should be able to at least go to System Properties and identify it. The reason why I say that is because a lot of the later operating systems past Windows 2000, like XP and Vista, well, you can make them look exactly like Windows 2000. So on first glance, it might actually be a more current operating system that just looks like Windows 2000. But the key thing to remember here as well is it's no longer supported by Microsoft. So you're not going to get, updated bug fixes and patches and things like this. So keep that in mind, because that could be critically important. Also, classic start menu. When we say classic start menu, it's going to look a lot like the old NT4 start menu and interface, where you kind of have the default Microsoft blue background. Actually, the NT4 was kind of a teal background. I guess that was a big upgrade. When you upgraded to Windows 2000, we went from green to blue. Anyway, as far as the start menu is concerned, though, this is a classic Windows 2000 start menu where the operating system's identified over on the left-hand side, and these just fly out menus. Notice that this is a single column of menu items that we have here. Okay, other versions of Windows will have 2 columns, or what we call a split start menu. Also, starting with Windows 2000, we had this quick launch area where you can see you can launch Outlook or Internet Explorer or minimize everything to the desktop. So if I open up a window here, if I have multiple windows open like this, if I wanted to clear all of those away quickly, you could just click this show desktop item and bam, it would immediately, it's supposed to immediately, there it goes, it will immediately minimize all of those to the desktop. Also, starting with Windows 2000, this is where they started to work with Windows Driver Model, which has a lot of big emphasis on it in terms of the stability of the drivers for your various hardware devices. And it's also where we started having signed drivers. So if I right-click on, right up here, right-click on my computer and choose Manage, then we go to Device Manager. We're not going to fully explore this for the time being. Just want to show you one example of this. Let's go to like a display adapter here. Again, I'm working within VMware, but here if I double-click on it and go to the Driver tab, notice that it says that it's got a digital signer. This is the Microsoft Windows Hardware Compatibility Publisher. This means it's been tested by Microsoft and found to be stable enough to be able to affix a signature to it. Now let's move on to something a little bit more fun than Windows 2000, and that would be Windows XP. And this one is clearly the most popular operating system Microsoft has ever come out with, at least to date. I expect we're going to see XP on desktops for at least a decade to come, because, again, corporations don't want to upgrade just because there's a new operating system. Very often there has to be a business reason for that. And if everything's working fine, it's the old saying, if it's not broken, don't fix it. However, there are some pressures to have people upgrade out of XP to Windows Vista or to Windows 7. And the first one of those, like Windows 2000, is that Windows XP is no longer supported. Actually, at the time of this recording it is, but in a month or two, actually a couple of months here, it will not be. So very likely by the time you hear this, XP will no longer be supported by Microsoft. Now here's a key thing to remember for A+ exam objective purposes, I would say, and that is when you're comparing the different editions and everything of Windows XP, for example, understand that if you want to join the computer to a domain, you can only do that with the professional edition. We've talked a little bit about domains in the past, so I think we should have some understanding of what that is. But remember, that's a security boundary. Normally it's going to be like an Active Directory domain as opposed to a DNS domain. But anyway, in order to do that, I might start here with the Start menu. And that, by the way, is another bullet point on my whiteboard that we saw just a moment ago. This has the new split Start menu. Notice that we don't have a single column like we did on Windows XP and previous operating systems. Now we have a split column. And the reason why this is done is because your most commonly used applications will now appear in this most recently used list. Okay, now this is a new installation, and the only thing I've really opened is the command prompt, so that made it appear right here. And this is to help to avoid you having to flip through so many menus. A lot of people, I've seen them, as they expand out their menus and they keep going out and further and further and further. This thing goes clear to the end, and then it starts to wrap back around to the left again. And if you just accidentally click off to the side, oh, great, I lost the whole thing, got to start all over again. And a lot of your users, you'll find, can be pretty clumsy with the mouse. I remember years ago when I first started teaching people how to use Windows, I had an elderly couple in my class, very sweet, wonderful elderly couple, the couple of farmers, and I think it was their son had given them a new computer. So I was teaching them how to use the mouse. People, it took all day long, and I actually literally had to put my hand on top of their hand to show them how to move the mouse all day long. I think it was the greatest test of my patience that I've ever experienced. Until I had children, and then I had new tests of patience, which we won't go into right now. Anyway, so this is the new Start menu that you see. Also, many people kind of make fun of this because they call it the Fisher-Price interface. It's the primary colors that we see here, and the look of the windows when you open them up. It's got these kind of Fisher-Price looking colors and everything like that. So that's kind of a joke that goes back and forth about this new Windows interface. But let's return to that Start menu. I do need to show you a few other things there. For example, what if I wanted to clear all of these programs? What if I didn't like this list that appears right here? Also, there's something here called My Recent Documents. Well, I haven't opened any documents, so nothing appears. But there might be documents open here that might be PowerPoint presentations, might be Word documents, and some of those might be sensitive or confidential. What if a document appears here that says, My Latest Resume, and I'm doing this on a work computer? Well, that could be quite revealing, and I wouldn't want my job to know that perhaps I'm looking for a new employer. So if you want to clear that, for whatever reasons, confidentiality, privacy, whatever, you can adjust a lot of these different things by right-clicking on the taskbar and then choosing Properties. Having gone into this then, you can do a few different things related to the Start menu, and you'll do that, of course, from the Start menu tab. And then here we have Start menu, and if you want to customize it, you simply do that by clicking that button. Here we can specify the number of programs to show on the Start menu, or we can clear the list entirely, and I'll go ahead and click that. And when you come back to that, after I click OK here, you'll see that the Start menu will then be cleared of those items. I can also, again, remove any of these items that I want to. If I don't want the internet or email to appear up there, I can do that. Change the size of the icons. All of those things work. And let me click OK through this to show you what we've got so far. You can see now that all of that has been cleared, and I don't have those default programs up at the top anymore. And then as we return to the properties of the Start menu again and go back to Customize, where I just was, we can see that we have several advanced options here as well. So for example, open submenus when I pause on them with my mouse. So if I go up here, and I don't really have one. There we go. I'll go to All Programs, and if I just pause on Accessories, notice that without clicking, things will start to fly out. Well, that's what that's about. You can also have that immediately fly out just by clicking on them. Highlight newly installed programs. I don't have anything newly installed, but if I did, then on all programs, they would be highlighted kind of in a yellow or an amber looking color, and then it would immediately kind of stand out as a new program. Here we can also display how the control panel appears. Does it appear as a link? For example, if I click up here and then click on control panel, this actually is a link. It doesn't look like it because it doesn't, underline when you put your mouse pointer over it or something like that. But in reality, that is what it is, so that it opens up a new window here once I click on it. I can also choose to display it as a menu, which will give me more flyouts so that I can just individually select whichever item I want, or don't display this item. You can enable dragging and dropping, which is of course just where you drag and drop things around, so that could be, I don't know why you would ever want to disable that unless someone had problems using the mouse properly. You can also specify whether or not a favorites menu appears, and that kind of explains itself. Help and support, whether or not that appears. Some of these, again, I don't know why you would disable them, but at least the options are available. Same thing is true of my computer as it was for the control panel. You can specify how those things appear, as well as the My Documents and My Music. Okay, all these different things can appear the same kind of way, so very similar in all of those respects. Here we have printers and faxes that can also appear, and that's where that item would be, for example. And I would just recommend that you go through these things and experiment with them, and I think the rest of these explain themselves pretty well, but I recommend that you select different items, enable them, disable them, and so forth, so you can get an idea for what appears. The only other thing that I would say is important for you to know about is the administrative tools. You see, if I click on Start and I have some kind of a system configuration change that I want to make, it's kind of hard to get there from here because there's no real administrative functions that I can do. But if I choose to display the system administrative tools, I can do that on the All Programs menu and the Start menu. And if I click OK and Apply right now, we'll see that I now have administrative tools here. And on All Programs, I also have administrative tools. Okay, so those will now be available in both of those locations. So then returning here, we see on the Start menu that all those things are cleared off. Also, if they don't like any of this stuff, any of the, let me go back here, how the way that all this stuff flies out and the look of all of this stuff, and the split Start menu and everything, maybe they're accustomed to an older version of Windows like NT or 2000 that didn't have that. Well, you can go back to the Start menu here and choose the classic Start menu instead. Now, it's kind of a peeve of mine when people won't update with the times, but I could click on Apply here and notice that they now get their old common desktop icons back. Then they get the single Start menu with the operating system listed over here on the left and all of that. Okay, so they decided not to go with the most current way of doing things. They probably have a mullet cut and they drive a Ford Pinto also. But anyway, that's up to them, up to the user's preference. Now, there's also some things on the taskbar here that you should be aware of. One of those is lock the taskbar. That's the first checkbox you see right there. Why would that be important? Well, a lot of users don't realize that they have done this, but they might accidentally click and drag here and they lose their Start menu. Okay, if that's the case, they may call you and say they don't have a Start menu anymore. If you just tell them to press the Windows key on their keyboard, it should pop up the Start menu, and then they can at least find the Start menu again. Then you know that you can just resize this back to the way it was. Otherwise, if you lock it here, then they're no longer going to get this. However, if you do that, it will also lock things such as the quick launch area that will appear down here, which I'll get to here in a moment. So just be aware of that. All right. Now also, you can auto-hide the taskbar if they need more desktop real estate, for example, and they want to have maximized windows take the entire space up. Then if we were to do that, let me actually switch back to this. And we're to auto-hide the taskbar and apply that, then notice that it now disappears anytime my mouse is not hovered over that space. Okay, so it just goes away that way. If I want to bring that back, then of course I could just move my mouse pointer back down there, and then I would just clear this auto-hide the taskbar item if I no longer wanted that behavior. Keep taskbar on top of other windows. This once again would mean that if I were to open up again something like my computer or whatever, notice that this always appears no matter what windows I have open, whether they're minimized, maximized, or whatever. Okay. However, if I were to keep the taskbar on top of other windows and clear that checkbox, now click Apply. Now notice that this window can cover up the taskbar. Just gives them a little bit more real estate. That's all that's really about. And I can also show the quick launch area. I actually turn this on for a lot of my users because they might have commonly used things that they like to use down here. Notice that I can resize this. If I lock the taskbar, however, it will take away that ability. Notice there's no longer the ability to resize that item either, that whole section down there at the bottom. And then also another thing that we will often do, at least that I do while I'm recording, is to not show the clock. And maybe that's because you don't want people at work being clock watchers, always seeing what time they're going to be able to get off, hoping that 5 o'clock will come faster than ever. I don't know why other reasons why you'd want to do this. I don't turn it on with my videos, and you can see there's no clock down here because there's a lot of times when I'll be interrupted during the recording process, and it might suddenly jump from 11 o'clock to 12:30 or something, and you wonder what happened. Well, in reality, I took an hour and a half lunch, but I don't want you to know about that. So I'll often hide the clock here just for what we're doing. And you can also hide inactive icons. So right now we just have a couple of things there, and this is a new operating system that I've installed. So we don't have a lot of commonly used functions that I've got that would appear down in the taskbar area. A lot of times you'll see things such as Windows notifications, or you'll see antivirus software will have an icon that appears down here. ATI may have an icon that appears down that location as well. Well, anyway, anything that I don't use very commonly will start to get covered up by this little button here that I can click to expand out, so that if I want to retrieve any of those items, I can. This is just designed to save taskbar area, because as this list grows, it kind of shoves over further and further to the left, and it takes away space from the taskbar area. So that's a lot of the different things that you can do with Windows XP in the Start menu and taskbar. And I spent a lot of time on this particular one instead of the more current operating systems. And the reason for that is because they all work the same way. So just about everything I've shown you here for Windows XP will also be true of Windows Vista and the upcoming Windows 7 as well. Now, the next version of Windows that we'll take a look at here is Windows Vista, which is the most current one available on the A+ exam. And a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about with Windows Vista, just as an FYI, will also translate, of course, into Windows 7, just in case you want to know about it. Now, there's some key things here. One of those is dramatic UI changes. These are mostly good in my view, not because they have a business purpose on their own, many of them, but because it just makes it more fun to work with Windows. I mean, let's face it, Windows was pretty boring in the way it looked before. One of the reasons why Macintosh has made such big inroads in the user desktop space is because people love the interface. And of course, Microsoft has to compete with that, and they started doing that with what we call the Arrow interface. Now, this Arrow interface, which I'm about to demonstrate for you, is available in all editions of Windows Vista except for Home Basic. Okay, and I'll put not allowed or something like that out here. Not in Home Basic, but of course available in Home Premium, Business, and Ultimate editions. And by way of demonstration of what Windows Arrow is, it's a lot of different things. One of those things that it does is it gives you what we call a glass interface. This is kind of a translucent start menu that you would see when you use the start menu, Windows borders and everything. Let me just show you this. This is the glass effect right here. I've got some photographs from the Grand Tetons a couple of years ago. And notice the title bar. It's kind of a semi-translucent glass-like interface. This is customizable, so you can adjust how transparent it is and what kind of colors are kind of visible. For example, you can see it's kind of a bluish color tint right there, and so forth. Here I was looking at a picture of a bear, by the way. I got to show you this. This is a bear I found that was eating on a carcass. I can't remember what kind of carcass it was. It might have been a moose or something like that. Anyway, he was staring me in the eye, and I decided to make a quick exit. And if that wasn't enough, then it went a little bit further down a couple of other days later, and I found this bear right here. And this bear is sniffing the air and looking right at me. I had just eaten a peanut butter granola bar, and I still had it in my pocket. And I know that he was smelling that, so I was a little bit nervous, and I had to make a speech. Actually, a park ranger came up and said, "Hey, you need to move right now," and told me that I needed to get out of there. So anyway, I've had a couple of supposedly close calls with bears. Fortunately, I had my bear mace with me in neither one of those cases. I was always very careful to take it along with me, and then right when I needed it, I happened to leave it in the trunk of the car. But anyway, that was the glass interface that you see. Now, let's take a look at a couple of other things that are available for us here as well. And part of those are things that are not really that easily demonstrated. For example, there's something called dynamic windows, that when you minimize a window, it minimizes kind of very obviously the taskbar, much like how Macintosh Windows minimized to the taskbar. There's also a higher DPI support, so the visual difference with Vista is going to give you a richer visual experience, which is not really going to be duplicated in the videos that I'm recording here with CBT Nuggets. Because of recording properties, I can't really show you that, but it's just supposed to be a better visual experience. Next, I've moved over here closer to the Start menu so that I can show you the taskbar area over here. Now, what we're going to see next here is something called live taskbar thumbnails, where as I pause the mouse pointer over whatever's on the taskbar, it shows me what I'm running there. So there's an outline from my current videos that I'm recording, and then here's Photoshop, which has the whiteboard that we just saw a moment ago. Here's Lightroom that I've got, and this is all live data, so that if it's something like even like a video, it'll actually show it in live motion. So right now I've got this paused, but this is my son again doing that indoor skydiving, and you can see him floating up into the air right there. So this is all live, and if movies, whatever's going on, YouTube videos, all of that would appear kind of in real time, so to speak. And then one of the other things we can use is the ability to switch between different windows. Now, in the past, we'd use the Alt-Tab key to do that, and you can still do that, but it's slightly different now in Windows Vista, because notice that here, as I press Alt-Tab, it first of all shows me a preview of it And then it also brings it to the forefront if I just kind of pause on it. So it brings all of these things up. Now, not all these appear on the same screen we're looking at right now. So that's just one way of going about doing all of these things. But the one I wanted to show you about specifically here was the Windows tab. And this is something called the 3D flip. Okay, and I can hold down the Windows key and tab. And notice that we can go through all of these things. And again, we see all of these things in kind of live video going on and so forth. So all of that kind of stuff takes place. Whoops. Oops, I'm self-incriminating here. I'm actually thinking about buying one of these things. Don't tell anybody, and don't judge me, people. Okay? I'm still making my living on Windows, so I can't let this get out into the public too much. All right. Anyway, so that's what we can use. Windows Flip, which is also known as Flip 3D. Another thing we have here, besides Windows Flip 3D, which I just described, is the sidebar gadgets. Now, as we take a look at Windows Vista over here, by default, you'll see a clock here, but I replaced that because, again, in CBT Nuggets, we don't use the clock. But this is a performance monitor that we have that shows how much memory and processor utilization is being used at the time. Some pictures that we can flip back and forth between, and a news feed that we see here as well. You can change any of these as you like. I can right-click on this sidebar, which contains these 3 gadgets at the current time. If you want to move the gadgets around, you can do that. I can drag this out to the side here, for example, and get a little bit better look at it. You don't have to keep it on the sidebar, but many people do. You can also do configuration items by clicking on the little monkey wrench or whatever it is, and making changes here as well. They're different for each different one, so there's no need to detail each individual item there. Now, if you decide you don't want the sidebar, don't want to use it anymore, you can close the sidebar. Normally, it's not too much in the way because other windows would, cover it up. For example, if I opened up my computer, notice that the sidebar is not going to get in the way of this. So we're usually fine with that. But if I wanted to close it, I could do that. And if I wanted to bring it back, it would show me how to do that here as well by going down to the bottom, and then I can right-click here and then choose Open again. Okay. You can also specify whether or not you want that to appear when Windows starts by going to the properties with a right click. And then I can say Start Sidebar when Windows starts. And of course, you can also see if you have multiple monitors that you can put it on multiple monitors, where you want it to appear, and things of this nature. If you want additional gadgets that don't appear here, you can right-click here and choose Add Gadgets. There's a lot of really good ones that are available online. I don't really use a lot of the ones that come out of the box, but you can get more gadgets online, and there's always new ones being added there. Then the other thing that we have here in Windows was something called User Account Control. And for that, I've really got a separate whiteboard because it kind of branches out into a lot of different things we'll need to know about. But this is basically a security feature because it will help to prevent malicious actions or installations using elevated privileges. Okay, so for example, let's say I'm logged on as an administrator, and a lot of home users do have local administrator accounts. In the corporation, many users do not, although some do. Why is it important whether or not they do or don't? If I'm logged on as an administrator, then I have full control over the machine, including installing software I want to install, as well as software that I might be getting tricked into installing. Maybe it's something that I went to a web page and I saw a little pop-up that said accelerate your Windows performance, and I clicked on it. In reality, very often those are spyware, adware, malware of some type. I'll talk more about those different types of software at a future point, but it could actually be something that would be malicious for myself or for my computer. This user account control, however, gives you a moment of pause because it pops open a window that says, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And then you'd have to click on continue to continue that. For example, let me just show you here. Here I've downloaded Adobe's Acrobat Reader, which is certainly safe software, and most everybody wants to use this software. But it could have also been malware, so that when I double click on this to launch it, this would appear. Very often with malware, the user will not even launch any application. This will just suddenly appear on the screen. This could be things that automatically execute when the user downloads them from the internet or they somehow stumble across them. Maybe they also have them on a USB flash drive. When they plug it into their computer, it automatically launches. So here they would at least have a moment of pause saying, hey, wait a minute, I didn't start that. Where did this come from? I think I'll cancel it. Now the reality is many of your users don't know and they don't care, and they say, oh, I don't know what that is. I guess I'll just click continue. So that could have been malware for all we know. Of course, again, in this case, it's actually just fine. Now, the user account control prompt that we saw there, the appearance of that can look slightly different depending upon what it is that you're doing. If you're installing drivers, it has a slightly different interface, but the message is the same, and the prevention effect is the same. If you're downloading a program from the internet, again, the similar kind of a thing, or if you're downloading unsigned programs. Now, this is also really no different than run as. And you see, a lot of administrators, when Windows Vista first came out, they objected to this because they said, oh, this gets in the way all the time. I always constantly have to click on continue this, continue that. And there is some justification to that argument. But as a security best practice, you should never do anything under an administrative account. As a Microsoft recommendation, even people that are high-level administrators should log on with a separate account that's just a generic user account which does not have a lot of privileges. And then when they want to perform some kind of an action, let's say they want to, go into something here and they want to run an application with administrative privilege. I can't really think of anything right now. I'm just going to go just about anywhere. Let's say I wanted to go to the snipping tool, whatever that is. Then I would right-click on that and choose Run as Administrator, and then they would get a user account control prompt here. In older versions of Windows, they would have the opportunity to enter in a username and a password. Okay. Now, with current versions of Windows, this allows me to log on as an administrator, but I still have to click on Continue in order to be able to allow that to perform. And sometimes you can get multiple prompts, which are a little bit annoying because you will have already told Windows that you want to perform a certain action, and then they'll ask you again. So let me show you an example. If I go to my computer here, let's go down to like the Windows directory, and if I wanted to delete, or modify some system file here, like Notepad. It won't actually let me delete this, but I'm going to delete this or press the delete key, and you'll see that it asks my permission. Well, I could click continue as an administrator, but then it asks me again. Why are you asking me twice? I just told you I wanted to delete that file. So I'm going to cancel that for the time being. But that's the kind of thing it does. It is a little bit naggy, and it asks you too many times sometimes. You can disable this if you want to. I don't recommend it, because it is a good security practice, especially in the corporation. And it does help to prevent things like spyware and adware from getting installed. But if you did want to disable this, you can go to Control Panel here, and then go into User Accounts, and then go into User Accounts again. And then down here you would see Turn User Account Control on or off. I would select that item. Again, I'd have to prompt for User Account Control. Kind of ironic. And then I would deselect this item, click OK, and then we would no longer have user account control. But again, I recommend that you do leave it on. And then finally, be aware of the fact that all Windows clients, Vista 2007, XP, whatever, they only allow 10 concurrent connections. And that's because it needs to be distinguished from a server. If Microsoft would have allowed unlimited connections, then you could set up a cheap Windows XP box somewhere as maybe a print server or a file server or something like that, and have the whole corporation accessing it. Well, that really wouldn't be fair to Microsoft's licensing model and profit margins. And we want to make sure Microsoft has plenty of profit margin. So that's what they made the servers for. So your clients are limited to 10 concurrent connections. That means then that if a user has shared a folder, then they can have up to 10 people connect to it. Or if a user has shared a printer, they can have up to 10 people over the network connect to it. And just keep that in mind. It's very important to know as an A+ exam objective. Now, in conclusion, let's talk here about compatibility mode for your applications as well. There's been several different generations of Windows, and application developers will write their applications for usually whatever the current version of Windows is. So if the application developer wrote a program for Windows NT4, for example, then that's what it's designed to work on. Now, some of those applications are hard-coded so that it has to be exactly Windows NT4. Other applications would say NT4 or greater, and there's certain programming language that can be used to identify which version of Windows it is. Well, a lot of the earlier programmers would be very hard and strict only with, say, NT4, and anything else it wouldn't work with, like Windows 2000 or XP or anything like that. This has really been a substantial frustration for a lot of people in the IT field, because a lot of times these applications that have been written might have been custom applications that a company spent a lot of money to get made, and then they have the application now and they own it, but when it's time to upgrade Windows, the company that originally wrote the application may no longer be in business, or may no longer support the company for some reason, or the company that bought that software, they just don't want to spend another few $100,000 to get that software for the latest version of Windows. So the key thing here is you might have a down level or an older application that's incompatible with whatever the current version of Windows is that you're trying to use. Now, one of the ways you might be able to get around those limitations is to use something called the run as command. And this is something we would generally use in something like Windows 2000. So if I'm back here on Windows 2000 Professional, and if I'm going to my programs and everything actually works, but let's just imagine that this WordPad was an old application that does not normally run under Windows 2000 because it needs special privileges. So I might have to go here and use a run as. How would I do that? Well, if you just right click, then you don't get a run as. But if you hold down Shift and press right click, notice that I now get a run as on my shortcut menu. So I press that, and then I would enter in the credentials for a specific user, and now I would be running that under their security credentials, and it would be able to do whatever my account could do. So if my account could read or write to protected operating system locations, then this application would have also been able to do the same thing. Now, with Windows Vista, that's a little bit different. Now, with Windows Vista, when we have an application we want to run like that, we simply right-click and choose Run as Administrator. If the user is not an administrator already, then they will be prompted for credentials, similar to what we saw in the Run as dialog box for Windows 2000. If they are the administrator, then when you click on this, it'll simply pop this open. I'd have to enter in my credentials, or my password anyway, and press Enter. And then it would go ahead and allow me to work with whatever this application was. One of the things that Microsoft has done to help ease the pain between application compatibility and their newer operating systems is to devise something called the Compatibility tab. Now, if I go to my Windows Vista installation here, for example, you'll notice that I've gotten to my computer, and there's something in the D drive here. This is actually a little kid's game, but it was designed for Windows 95, and it may not always work in current operating systems. So I would double-click on this, and I would find the executable. In this case, it's the application right here called AutoBall. And I would right-click on this, and I would not run it as administrator necessarily, but I would go to the properties of this item. I might also need to run it as an administrator if it wants to write to protected areas, but I would go to compatibility, and here's where I could say, run this program in compatibility mode for, and then whichever operating system it is that we were interested in. You see, if the application was written for Windows 95, then when it launches with all this having been selected, it will check for the Windows version. And now the operating system will lie to it and say, no, I'm not Windows Vista, I'm Windows 95. Similarly, you see some other items in here that relate to graphics. A lot of these do. Run in 256 colors, 640 by 480. Some of the older applications don't know how to handle a larger color depth or more colors or more higher resolution. Disable visual themes, again, if that also causes conflicts with it, and so forth. So there's all these things that can be very useful in that. Now, another thing I could do is if I had multiple users that use this same computer, and maybe it's like a nurse's workstation where I might have one nurse after the other come up to the workstation and have to run an application that does whatever, I don't know, looks at x-rays or something like that. Well, I might want to have these settings changed for anybody that would use it. And if that were the case, I would choose Show Settings for All User. I would enter in my password for the administrative account, and then I would make the changes here as well. Then, no matter who it was that logged on to the computer, would get those same settings. In this case, I'm just going to leave it for my existing user, and then we'll go ahead and run the application. All right, folks, and then now what I've done is I've launched that game, and now we can play this very, very productive business-like game during work hours. So I'll just click on Go over here, and the whole object of this game is to take this car and bounce the dog out of the car till it hits the balloons. You see how it teaches our kids all about real life? So anyway, that's all you do. You just try to hit these balloons, and oops, drop the dog. All right, let's try this one more time, folks. I'm a little determined. Try it again, and oh, drop the dog again. All right, I'll admit it. I did that on purpose. What can I say, folks? I've got a little bit of a mean streak about me. But anyway, that's that whole thing. We can play that game because of the fact we had that compatibility tab. Also keep in mind, though, that with 16-bit applications, that you're not going to be able to work with those on Windows Vista and following, okay, or Windows 7. That's because the 16-bit applications are no longer supported by Microsoft. They just did not want to do that anymore because they're so unstable, and Microsoft has to do certain compatibility tricks in previous versions of Windows to get those 16-bit apps to work. And Microsoft really has pretty much abandoned that, and there's not a lot of applications out there that are left that are 16-bit 16-bit applications. They're usually going to be very, very old and probably, once again, written for maybe Windows 95 or something like that. So if you have these 16-bit apps, now what are you going to do? Because you might be stuck with that. Your company won't buy new software. They tell you have to use that. Now what? Well, you can use VMware. That's what I use, in fact. So I can run Windows 95 and run an older application in Windows 95 in a virtual machine. Now, that can happen with VMware or virtual PC, or you could use other things on a server level, such as Hyper-V, which runs on Windows Server 2008 servers. So all of those different ways are being able to run virtualization to run those things instead. Now, this is not really related to the A+ exam because it relates to Windows 7. But if you're running Windows 7, you can run Windows 7 plus XP mode. And this is something that you can download from Microsoft. It is actually a virtual machine that's running Windows XP. And if you have an application that runs optimally on Windows XP but not on Windows 7 for some reason, then you can run that on the client computer. You don't need an extra license or anything like that. It's already included in your current licensing if you can get it. And so it actually is pretty transparent to the user as well. Although, of course, you'll have to have a little bit more resources because now you're going to be running pretty much two operating systems in one. And there's also something called a DOS box. I don't really have a lot that I'm going to endorse on this, but I just wanted to point out to you that this is available if you want to investigate it. If you just go to dosbox.com, you can see here, this allows you to run certain applications in a kind of a DOS box that would not otherwise be able to run in current versions of Windows. So it's not an A+ exam question that you'll see here that you might or might not be able to use this, but it is worth looking into if you're experiencing problems with those 16-bit apps. In this nugget, we took a look at a Windows overview and compatibility. We started off by taking a look at the differences between 32-bit Windows and 64-bit. Remember, you have to have a 64-bit processor to take advantage of 64-bit Windows, but you also have to have the appropriate drivers and applications if you really want to maximize it. We also took a look at memory limits, and remember, if you're working with a 32-bit version of Windows, you're going to max out at 4 gigabytes. Okay? That might not be what you want. In fact, most of my machines right now, I'm working at least 8 gigabytes, but depends on what your workload is as well. To get 8 gigabytes or anything beyond 4, you're going to need to go to 64-bit versions of Windows. And then we also looked at a Windows overview, just some of the key characteristics, mainly in the interface, between the various versions of Windows. We looked at user account control so that we can identify how to work around those prompts that we see and why those prompts appear in the first place. And then finally, we concluded with a look at Windows compatibility mode and how to make a lot of our applications more compatible so that we can get them to run in current versions of Windows. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.